Africa gains UNSC seats. But is it truly worth celebrating? Before you rush to celebrate Africa's new seats at the UN Security Council, pause. The West hasn't granted Africa the full power it deserves. These seats come without veto rights. Dr. Arikana put it best when she called it not a favor, but an insult to Africa. So, what's going on here? Let's find out. The United Nations Security Council (UNSC) is the most powerful body within the UN, charged with maintaining international peace and security. It's the council that makes the big decisions, resolutions on conflicts, sanctions, and even military interventions. But not all members are equal. Since the end of World War II, 5 nations have held permanent seats and the ultimate trump card: veto power. China, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, all victors of a war that ended nearly 80 years ago, continue to shape global policy by wielding this veto power, blocking any resolution that doesn't align with their national interests. Now, in the 21st century, discussions around reforming the United Nations Security Council are becoming more frequent, and Africa's inclusion is one of the central topics. The proposal to allocate 2 permanent seats to African nations has resurfaced with renewed intensity. At first glance, this might seem like long overdue progress, a recognition that Africa, with its 1.4 billion people and growing global influence, deserves a place at the world's most important decision-making table. But as always, there's a catch. These seats come without veto power. And that's a problem. Veto power is not just some symbolic perk. It's the most powerful tool within the UNSC. Without it, African nations would essentially be spectators at their own games. It's like being invited to sit at the dinner table but being told you can't vote on what's being served. Sure, you get to witness the conversation, but you don't get to change the outcome. This proposal, then, raises more questions than it answers. Is it a step toward equality, or just another empty gesture to pacify the growing demand for Africa's inclusion? The truth is, without veto power, Africa's permanent seats on the UNSC would do little to change the power dynamics at play. The current permanent members, China, Russia, the US, the UK, and France, have used their vetoes to shape the world in ways that serve their national interests, often at the expense of others. The United States, for example, has used its veto power to block resolutions critical of Israel over 50 times. Russia and China have blocked resolutions on Syria multiple times. These vetoes have shaped the global order for decades, often leaving smaller nations, particularly in Africa, on the losing end. So, the real question is, what does Africa's inclusion without veto power mean? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. On the surface, it looks like progress, a recognition that Africa is too important to ignore. But underneath, it's more of the same. Africa would still be left out of the most important decisions, relying on the goodwill of the same 5 nations that have historically acted in their interests. It's a proposal that keeps the status quo intact, offering just enough to make it seem like change is happening without actually changing anything at all. To understand why this proposal is problematic, we need to look at Africa's long history of exclusion from global decision-making. This isn't just a recent phenomenon, it's been happening for centuries. In 1884, European powers gathered at the Berlin Conference to carve up Africa, drawing borders and deciding the fate of entire nations without a single African leader present. It was colonialism in its rawest form, a blatant disregard for African sovereignty, and the consequences of that conference are still being felt today. Even after gaining independence, African nations have found themselves marginalized in global forums. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank, institutions created by Western powers to manage the global economy, have imposed policies on African countries that often do more harm than good. Structural adjustment programs, which were supposed to promote economic growth, instead led to austerity measures that crippled social services and deepened poverty. African countries were forced to accept these policies because they had little say in how these global institutions were run. The UNSC is no different. Since its creation in 1945, it has been dominated by 5 permanent members: none of whom come from Africa. Even though many of the world's conflicts occur on the African continent, African nations have little say in how those conflicts are addressed. The veto power held by the permanent members ensures that global decisions are made in a way that benefits the few at the expense of the many. The proposal to grant Africa 2 permanent seats without veto power is a continuation of this legacy of exclusion. It echoes the same dynamics that have defined Africa's relationship with the global order for centuries. Just as European powers once made decisions about Africa's future without African input, so too are the global powers now offering Africa a seat at the table without giving it the power to influence the outcome. It's colonialism in a new form, wrapped in the language of progress and reform. This is why many African leaders and activists, like Dr. Arikana Kwao, see the proposal as an insult. Dr. Arikana, the former African Union ambassador to the United States, has long been a vocal advocate for Africa's full inclusion at the UNSC. She argues that accepting permanent seats without veto power would be a betrayal of Africa's potential. It would be like being invited to a meeting but not being allowed to speak, a symbolic gesture that lacks real substance. For Dr. Arikana and many others, Africa deserves more than just a seat. It deserves the right to influence global decisions in a meaningful way.
That the addition of 2 African countries is going to make the process dysfunctional. What an insult. If this particular situation, we're talking a country like Germany.
But why the West doesn't want Africa to have veto power? When pressed on the issue of veto power for Africa, Western nations often cite concerns about the functionality of the UNSC. They argue that expanding veto privileges to more countries could lead to increased gridlock and dysfunction, making it even harder for the Council to take decisive action. But let's be real, the current system is already dysfunctional. The real reason for denying veto power to Africa is to maintain control. The current permanent members of the United Nations Security Council have a vested interest in keeping the Council's power concentrated in their hands. Granting Africa veto power would shift the balance of power in ways that could challenge their dominance. African nations, with their unique geopolitical concerns and interests, would likely push for policies that do not align with those of the West. By denying Africa veto power, the permanent members can continue to shape global policies without significant opposition from the global South. This is not a new phenomenon. The West has long resisted giving Africa a real voice in global governance. From the International Monetary Fund and World Bank to the World Trade Organization (WTO), Western nations have used their influence to ensure that the global system continues to serve their interests. The denial of veto power is just the latest example of this dynamic. It allows the West to continue benefiting from Africa's resources while denying the continent a meaningful say in how those resources are managed. It's a familiar pattern, one that stretches back to colonial times, when European powers exploited Africa's land, labor, and resources without ever offering the continent a seat at the decision-making table. The reluctance to grant Africa veto power is a clear reflection of the West's deeper insecurities about its place in the world. As Africa's influence grows, along with the rise of other global powers like China, the Western-led order that was established after World War II is starting to crack. The West is losing its grip, and it knows it. The idea of a multipolar world, where Africa, Asia, and Latin America have a real say in global governance, terrifies the old guard. It means they would have to share power, a concept they've resisted for centuries. The denial of veto power is about maintaining the current hierarchy, where the West, along with Russia and China, continue to dominate global decision-making. The UNSC is structured to ensure that the post-World War II order remains intact, with only a select few holding the real power. By keeping veto power out of Africa's hands, the West is making it clear that it has no intention of giving up its position at the top. It's not about functionality or efficiency, it's about control. The veto system itself has been dysfunctional for decades, with the 5 permanent members using it to block resolutions that don't align with their interests, even when those resolutions are in the best interest of global security. So the argument that granting Africa veto power would somehow lead to more dysfunction is a smokescreen, a convenient excuse to keep the current power structure in place. As Africa continues to fight for full representation at the United Nations Security Council, it becomes increasingly clear that the continent must look beyond Western-dominated institutions if it wants to assert its independence on the global stage. The fight for veto power at the UN is just one part of a broader struggle for African empowerment. The real question is, should Africa continue to invest its energy in trying to reform these outdated institutions? Or should it forge new alliances and create new systems that better reflect its interests and values? In recent years, Africa has been strengthening its ties with non-Western powers, particularly China and Russia. These alliances offer a much-needed alternative to the West's exploitative grip. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, has brought massive infrastructure investments to Africa, providing roads, railways, ports, and energy projects that have helped boost economic development across the continent. While these partnerships are not without their challenges, concerns about debt dependency, for example, they represent a significant departure from the traditional donor-recipient relationship that Africa has had with the West. Russia, too, has become a key player in Africa, offering military support to countries dealing with internal conflicts and instability. While Russia's involvement has been criticized for fueling violence in some regions, it has also provided African nations with much-needed security assistance that they could not obtain from Western powers. The West has often used its military interventions in Africa as a way to advance its geopolitical interests, rather than genuinely helping the continent address its security challenges. This shift toward non-Western alliances represents a growing realization among African leaders that the West's model of engagement is no longer serving their interests. For decades, African countries have been forced to play by rules that were written by Western powers, rules that were designed to keep Africa dependent and underdeveloped. By forging stronger ties with countries like China and Russia, African nations are beginning to rewrite those rules, asserting their right to make decisions that benefit their people. But Africa must be careful not to replace one form of dependency with another. While partnerships with non-Western powers offer new opportunities, they also come with their own set of risks. China's investments, for instance, have raised concerns about debt dependency, with some African countries finding themselves burdened by unsustainable levels of debt. Russia's military support has been criticized for fueling conflict in certain regions, and there are legitimate concerns about the long-term consequences of relying too heavily on foreign military assistance. The key for Africa is to strike a balance. It must diversify its global partnerships, engaging with both Western and non-Western powers on terms that are fair and equitable. This means insisting on mutual respect and benefit in all of its relationships, whether they are with China, Russia, or the United States. Africa must ensure that its alliances are based on shared interests, not exploitation, and that its leaders prioritize the well-being of their people over short-term political gains. The fight for full representation at the United Nations Security Council is part of this broader effort to reshape Africa's role in the world. By demanding veto power, African nations are sending a clear message. We will no longer accept being treated as second-class citizens in global governance. But this fight extends beyond the UN. Africa must continue to push for greater influence in other global institutions, from the IMF to the World Trade Organization (WTO), and it must work to build new institutions that better reflect the realities of a multipolar world. In the end, we must ask, what does this resistance to not letting Africa have veto power tell us about the West? The debate over Africa's inclusion at the UNSC without veto power reveals something important about the West's mindset. It's not just about Africa, it's about the broader global order. For decades, the West has been the dominant force in international affairs, shaping global governance to reflect its interests. But that dominance is being challenged. The rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the growing influence of African, Asian, and Latin American nations are reshaping the global landscape. And the West is terrified. The reluctance to grant Africa full rights at the UNSC is just one example of the West's broader strategy to maintain its grip on power. By denying Africa veto power, the West is signaling that it's not ready to embrace a truly multipolar world. It's clinging to the old order, where a handful of Western nations set the rules and everyone else follows. This is why the US, the UK, and France have been so resistant to any meaningful reform of the UN Security Council. They understand that giving Africa a real voice would fundamentally change the dynamics of global governance. This insecurity isn't new. The West has always been afraid of losing control. After World War II, the United States and its allies built a global system designed to enshrine their dominance. Institutions like the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank were created to ensure that Western powers could continue to shape the global economy and international politics in their favor. The UNSC's veto system is a perfect example of this. By concentrating power in the hands of the victors of a war that ended nearly 80 years ago, the West ensured that it would always have the final say in global matters. But the world has changed. The global balance of power is shifting, and the old Western-dominated order is beginning to crumble. The rise of China and the strengthening of BRICS are clear signs that the future of global governance will be multipolar, with many centers of power rather than just one. Africa, with its vast resources, growing economies, and youthful population, is poised to play a key role in this new world order. The West's reluctance to grant Africa veto power at the UNSC is a reflection of its fear of this future. It's a sign that the old guard is not ready to let go of the reins, even as the world moves on. By keeping Africa out of the decision-making process, the West is trying to preserve a system that was built to maintain its dominance. But this strategy is unsustainable. The world is changing, and the West cannot hold on to its position forever. In the long run, denying Africa veto power will only hasten the West's decline. As African nations continue to forge stronger ties with non-Western powers, the balance of power will shift further away from the old Western-led order. The United Nations Security Council, like other global institutions, will become increasingly irrelevant if it fails to adapt to the new realities of a multipolar world. Africa's fight for full representation is part of a broader movement to reshape global governance, and the West's refusal to embrace this change will only accelerate its decline. Do you think Dr. Arikana is right? Should African nations be given the veto? When will the whole world raise voice on this discrimination? Let us know in the comments section. Do you think Africa should accept these seats? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.